In this example, we're going to configure a BW500 on Profibus and Profinet. Both are connected to an S7-400, however, this example would work for an S7-1200 or even an S7-1500. I'm going to show you two methods of configuration. The first method is a full configuration, which allows parameter access read-write, and the second shows you an example of how to do a reduced memory map. So if there's just a number of variables you want and you don't want everything, you can use that method. Now in TO Portal, it has a very handy feature which allows us to actually go and scan our Profibus or Profinet networks. So if we expand our tree here, we will actually go to our CP57 interface card, and this will scan the Profibus DP network for all of our Profibus devices. Now the BW500 has a SmartLinks card inserted, which interfaces between the BW500 and the bus. Now when you're scanning the network, and we should actually find the BW500 here at address 44, you'll actually notice that the actual identification will actually say any bus rather than BW500. And that's because of that interface card interfacing between the bus and the BW500. So here we have our card at address 44 and it's labeled any bus, but that is our BW500. So let's go find our Profinet device. So if we actually go on and scan our network, with this time we're going to scan the Ethernet network for our BW500 connected on Profinet. So we actually see that we have a device here that has no name, just a MAC address, no name, no IP address, so the device has not been configured by the I/O controller yet. So just to make life a little bit easier, if we actually go online to the BW500, we actually go and set a name. So in our example, let's set BW500, and we can assign the name. Now once we assign a name, this name will be written to the BW500, and if we rescan our network, we will actually see now that the BW500 has a name. So now that we have our devices and we've found them on our networks, we can move on to the next step, which of course is configuring our hardware configuration. So in a hardware configuration, we're actually going to do a full configuration, which allows us to do full read-write access to the BW500. So let's take a look at the BW500 Profibus version first. However, the configuration is similar for both Profibus and Profinet. On the Profibus version, all we have to do first of all is to actually set a Profibus DP address. And in our example here, we're going to use address 44. We just need to add our module configuration. So as default, the BW500 has 34 words of input and 19 words of output. Now the modules are on the side here can be chosen to change that configuration, but we will address that a little bit later. So we need to make a note of our input addresses and our output addresses, because these will be used in our I/O configuration in our tag table. So make sure you just make a note of those. So let's take a look at the Profinet configuration, and it's going to be very similar. Again, we look at the properties, and all we have to do on the Profinet version here is we actually have to give the device a name. So as we said earlier, we're going to call this BW500, and this is a name that the I/O controller will use to identify the BW500 and then pass down the IP address once it has found the device. So we will actually define our IP address here, 192.168.1.27, and just like our Profibus module, we need to also configure our I/O modules too. So again, just like the Profibus version, we have 34 words of input and 19 words of output. And of course the modules again on the right hand side here can be used to change that hardware configuration. And we'll discuss this later when we talk about the reduced memory map. So let's make a note of the input addresses and make a note of the output addresses, because these will be used in our tag list to identify our I/O. So in our sample project here, we're going to now look at our PLC tags, or tags that we have created. So let's take a look at the Profibus tags first of all. And if we drill down under our S7400 and we go down and look at our I/O tags, let's have a look at the read block tags. Now, if we open our tag list, we can actually see that we've actually defined all of the tags here, and these can be referenced in the SmartLinks manual for the Profibus DP card. So those are our read block tags, and if you remember, we actually pulled the addresses. In our case, we started at address 500 for our inputs, and this is where we set it in our hardware configuration, if you remember. So that's for our read block. If we look at our write block for our Profibus DP module, we can actually see the tags that we've defined there. So again, our tags are starting as outputs at addresses 500. And again, we took that address of 500 from our hardware configuration here, and this is our output block here. So this is where the I/O tag ties up to our input and our output I/O address. Now, of course, exactly the same process applies for our Profinet card as well. We define the read block, and again, here's our read block starting this time with address 600 for our inputs. And again, that address came from our module. So if we go back and take a look at our hardware configuration and we look at the Profinet module, we can actually see that here's our input address of 600. So this is where we started from. So that's our input, or our read block, for the Profinet module. The same can be said for the write block. So if we take a look at the write block, again, we're starting our outputs at 600. And of course, if we look at the Profinet hardware configuration, we'll see that our write block addresses occur at 600. So that's how the I/O tags are actually referenced back to the I/O addresses of the BW500, or the SmartLinks card. And that's our tag list. So all we need to do is download to the S7400, and we then can start actually reading data from the BW500 via the watch tables. Now that we have all of our tag information configured, we can actually go online with the BW500. So if we now navigate through our watch tables, and let's take a look at the Profinet read block first of all. So if we actually go online with the S7400, so let's open our watch table, we can see that we have our live process data from the BW500. So we can see we have, for example, the rate, load, speed, and total. And if we refer to the SmartLinks manual here, and we can actually see the elements of the read block. Further down the table, we can actually see the section which deals with parameter access, and this is the section which allows us to read and write the parameters to the BW500. And I'll get to that a little later. So if we take a look at the Profibus DP read block, exactly the same. So the memory mapping is the same. So again, we would have the rate, load, speed, total, and all that other information as well. And of course, lower down the table, we would have that single parameter access area, which will allow us to read and write in the same way as we would on the Profibus DP version as well. In addition to the read-write blocks, you may also want to perform certain functions in the BW500. So here we have the command control word, and the command control word allows us to set certain functions or perform certain functions, like maybe change the PID mode or maybe reset the totalizers. So you have to ensure parameter 799 is set to 1 for remote communication write. And then what you can do is set the particular function. So in this example here, if we go along and we set bit 8 in our command control word, we can actually go and reset totalizer number 1. So if we set bit 8 to a 1, and we go and actually update our watch and write the 1 to the BW500, we'll actually see that the totalizer has actually reset. Now, of course, in addition, we can do the same with totalizer number 2. So if we set totalizer number 2 or set bit 9 here, and we update our watch table, we can actually see that totalizer number 2 has now gone and cleared. Now, just so we can show you the operation is the same for the Profinet BW500, let's go and take a look at the reset watch table for the Profinet module. And again, if we open our watch table for the Profinet module, and let's perform the same reset. So again, same idea, we have the command control word. And again, if we go and we set bit 8 in our control word, we can actually update. And we'll actually see that the totalizer has actually gone back to 0. If we do the same for totalizer number 2, and we go and update our watch table and write it to the BW500, we'll see that totalizer number 2 has also reset. So with the full configuration, it allows us to actually go and read-write to the BW500. So here's our watch table. And in our watch table here, we are just going to demonstrate how we read a parameter or write a parameter. So if we, for example, use parameter 11, a primary index of 1 and a secondary index of 0. And I want to read the value with 2 decimal places. So let's enter a value of 2 for our decimal places. Now, of course, we want to make sure our read-write flag is at 0, or it's because we just want to read. If we update our watch table, we'll actually see now that we have a value of 4500. Now, if you remember, we have 2 decimal places. So that number is actually 45.00. And if we check on the BW500 and go to parameter 11, we'll see that that value is actually 45.00. So that's fine. But what about if we want to write a value? Well, let's go and write a value to parameter 11. So we leave the parameter number the same. We need the primary index and the secondary index the same. But let's say we want to write a value of 37.00. So we enter our 37 into the new value. We tell the BW500 we have 2 decimal places, and we set our write flag, push our update, and if we go back to the BW500, we can see that the value has now changed to actually 37. So that's how we read and write parameters to the BW500. Now, I specifically used parameter 11 there as an example because parameter 11 is one of those parameters in the BW500 which has dependencies or is dependent on other parameters. So if we make a change to parameter 11 through the local user interface or the keypad on the BW500, if we change the value in that parameter, what actually happens is it will actually direct us to other sub-parameters. Now, if we change the value here, we'll notice that the parameter then actually takes us to parameter 14. And then it will actually then take us to parameter 15. Now, this requires the user to push the enter key at the BW500. However, over smart links, the enter key would not get pressed. So you would only be changing parameter 11 and not its dependency parameters. It's just something you have to be aware of when writing to some other parameters in the BW500. Now, I mentioned at the start of the tutorial that we were going to show you two methods of configuring the BW500. Well, the first method, as you have seen, allows you to do full read-write access of the BW500. So let's say we don't really need the parameter access and we just want to read some of the process values and maybe do a little bit of control. Well, let's see how we do that. Firstly, of course, we add a device. So let's say take a Profibus device here. And it doesn't matter if it's the Profibus version or the Profinet version, the mechanism is exactly the same. Let's attach our Profibus device to the network. And once we have it attached to the network, we're going to give our device an address. Well, in this example, we're going to use 45 for our DP address. And now we're going to move on to our module configuration. Well, in this instance, what we would like to do is maybe read the BW500 status, which is actually 2 bytes or 1 word. Let's actually give everything some labels here. So we're going to have this BW500 status, and actually let's just label this as well, BW500. So we have our status, which has taken 2 bytes or 1 word. Next, let's add in the rate. So this time our rate takes up 2 words or 4 bytes. And let's just label that up, rate. And next we want the totalizer. So totalizer number 1, which again is 2 words or 4 bytes. So let's label up totalizer number 1. And we're adding totalizer number 2 as well. So that's all of our inputs. That's actually 7 words of input now instead of 34. And so just like before, we're going to just add our IO addresses. And of course, these are the IO addresses that will be used, of course, in the tag table. So let's address those. Okay, in addition, what you may want to do, of course, is actually add some control. So just like before, but this time we're going to just use the control word. Now the control word, as you remember, allows us to reset the totalizer, set the PID mode, and a few other functions too. So if we add that to our configuration and we address that as well, that now means that we actually have 7 words of input and 1 word of output from the original 34 words of input and 19 words of output. So our memory map is drastically reduced. So all we need to do now is download to our S7400 and change parameter 762 as per the chart here. Now once you do the changes to parameter 762, you must repower the BW500. So now we have our reduced memory map. Let's see if it actually works. So if you recall, we have our hardware configuration. We have 7 words of input and 1 word of output. Our input addresses start at 700, and our output address for our single word, it starts at 700 too. So I'm going to skip a step here and actually go directly to the watch table, because if I want, what I can actually do is actually enter the addresses directly in the watch table without actually creating any tags. So if you didn't have access to, or were not allowed to create any tags, you can actually use the watch table, which means you don't actually have to download to the PLC. So as you can see here, we're online. We can see our status, our rate, and we can see our 2 totalizer values. As we've created the 1 word of output for our control word, and that is at output address PQW700, we can use that control word to reset the totalizer or change a PID mode, just like we did when we were using the full memory map. So if we look at our command control word, we can again set a bit. So if we set, for example, bit 8, and then we go and actually update our tag table and write the 1 to the BW500, we'll see that the totalizer clears back to 0. Again, the same would apply if we want to reset totalizer number 2. We'll actually set bit 9 now to a 1, and we will go and update our tag table once again, and we'll see that totalizer number 2 is now reset. So this is an example of the reduced memory map which you can use in the BW500.